Are we going to see a global currency reset? The case for something like a global currency reset is interesting, and harks back to the darkest financial days of recent times. In 2008, as the world economy was teetering on the edge of the abyss, thoughts were moving towards how this situation could have occurred and how to prevent this occurrence in the future. Recently I read an article discussing the inevitability of a global currency reevaluation and reset. For most observers and even many traders, the first questions that comes to mind is not the merits or failings of such an issue, but something much more fundamental: what is a global currency reset? There is a reason that most people are not familiar with the concept. That is because it is something that has rarely been used in recent history. Only once in the last 100 years, after World War II, with the fear of another Great Depression in the air and a note of conciliation in the collective minds of politicians the world over, at the famous Bretton Woods Conference, was this achieved. It was effective in preventing another depression, and in fact, the years post-World War II saw strong economic recovery as the world recovered from its wartime slump and industry exploded. It was also a unique confluence of circumstances. The world had been decimated by war, and countries had come together collectively to fight a common enemy. It was the last time that much of the world had stopped thinking exclusively about sovereign interests and banded together for international goals. The lives of foreign nationals became important, and armies fought for and protected the lands of their neighbors. Politicians had become used to thinking about the interests of their allies. This alone made it a unique time in history for collaborative action and collaborative will. The reason this is relevant is because a global currency reset is where all the nations, or at least a vast majority, agree to one currency standard, like gold, for example. The critical factor is agreement between countries, which is only ever achieved when the needs and interests of those countries are aligned. The case for something like a global currency reset is interesting, and harks back to the darkest financial days of recent times. In 2008, as the world economy was teetering on the edge of the abyss, thoughts were moving towards how this situation could have occurred and how to prevent this occurrence in the future. The leaders of the world wanted to create a situation where irresponsible activities in another country did not destroy their economy. Post-Bretton Woods, the main reserve currency held by countries was the US dollar, yet another reason that worldwide financial issues were so encompassing. Would a reset be the solution? Ultimately, the world did not go that way. Post-World War II was a unique time, where not only was there a global consensus but also mutual interest. Post-2008, the mutual interest was lacking. The simple fact that some countries would have benefited less from a global reset, meant that it would take significant political will to undermine this element. To surrender control of monetary policy because of the failures of another country would be unthinkable politically. Resets would limit the ability of central banks, a major point of friction that is playing out in Europe. Not to mention the fighting that would arise amongst countries trying to set the new standard. Just think of the varying positions and interests of Russia, China and the USA, and you can imagine how easily this would be solved. Is the world likely to see another global currency reset? Honestly, it would take a worldwide disaster the level of World War II to bring together the world for a reset. So if a reset does become a reality, we can probably agree that it is likely to be the least of our problems. China is calling for a global currency to replace the dominant dollar, showing a growing assertiveness on revamping the world economy ahead of next week's London summit on the financial crisis. The surprise proposal by Beijing's central bank governor reflects unease about its vast holdings of U.S. government bonds and adds to Chinese pressure to overhaul a global financial system dominated by the dollar and Western governments. Both the United States and the European Union brushed off the idea. The world economic crisis shows the inherent vulnerabilities and systemic risks in the existing international monetary system, Governor Zhu Xiaochuan said in an essay released Monday by the bank. He recommended creating a currency made up of a basket of global currencies and controlled by the International Monetary Fund, and said it would help to achieve the objective of safeguarding global economic and financial stability. Zhu did not mention the dollar by name. But in an unusual step, the essay was published in both Chinese and English, making clear it was meant for a foreign audience. China has long been uneasy about relying on the dollar for the bulk of its trade and to store foreign reserves. Premier Wen Jiabao publicly appealed to Washington this month to avoid any response to the crisis that might weaken the dollar and the value of Beijing's estimated $1 trillion in treasuries and other U.S. government debt. For decades, the dollar has been the world's most widely used currency. Many governments hold a large portion of their reserves in dollars. Crude oil and many commodities are priced in dollars. Business deals around the world are done in dollars. But the financial crisis has highlighted how America's economic problems, and by extension the dollar, can wreak havoc on nations around the world. China is in a bind. To keep the value of its currency steady, some say undervalued, the Chinese government has to recycle its huge trade surpluses, and the biggest, most liquid option for investing them is U.S. government debt. To better insulate countries from the ills of one country or one currency, Zhu said the IMF should create a reserve currency based on shares in the body held by its 185 member nations, known as special drawing rights, or SDRs. He said it also should be used for trade, pricing commodities and accounting, not just government finance. In Washington, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke and Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner both rejected China's call for a global alternative to the US dollar's role as the international reserve currency. And the European Union's top economy official said the dollar's role as the international reserve currency is secure despite China's proposal. Everybody agrees also that the present world reserve currency, the dollar, is there and will continue to be there for a long period of time, EU Commissioner Joaquin Almunia said Tuesday after a meeting of the European Commission. Zhu also called for changing how SDRs are valued. Currently, they are based on the value of four currencies, the dollar, euro, yen and British pound. The basket of currencies forming the basis for SDR valuation should be expanded to include currencies of all major economies, he wrote. Beijing has been unusually bold in recent months in expressing concern about Washington's financial management and pushing for global economic changes. That reflects both its relative financial health and growing concern that increased globalization means missteps abroad could harm its own economy. Zhu's comments are also part of China's long-standing push to reform the IMF, World Bank and global financial system to give greater voice to China and other developing economies. Another theme that will be heard from China, Brazil, Russia and India at the summit of Group of 20 major economies next week. Overdue reforms should give proper representation to and increase the say of the emerging and developing economies, Yi Xianrong, a researcher with the Institute of Economics and Finances at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, a government think tank, wrote in the government newspaper China Daily. Proper representation and a bigger voice for the developing countries are the need of the hour. For instance, being the world's third largest economy and the largest foreign reserves holder, China should get its due place in the monetary body. Another idea Yi raised was that the US and Europe should give up their traditional privileges of appointing the heads of the World Bank and the IMF. The idea of creating a new global reserve currency isn't new. But analysts say the proposal isn't likely to gain much traction because it faces major obstacles. It would require acceptance from nations that have long used the dollar and hold huge stockpiles of the US currency. There has been for decades talk about creating an international reserve currency and it has never really progressed, said Michael Bettis, a finance professor at Peking University's Guanghua School of Management. Managing such a currency would require balancing the contradictory needs of countries with high and low growth or with trade surpluses or deficits, Pettis said. He said the 16 European nations that use the euro have faced huge difficulties in managing monetary policy even though their economies are similar. It's hard for me to imagine how it's going to be easier for the world to have a common currency for trade, he said.